You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
US Republicans get their budget passed, if by a wafer-thin margin. Now what? Which countries are more or less democratic than they were last year? And the European rail renaissance continues. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests, Patty Cohen and Vincent McAviney, will discuss the day's big stories, and we will leaf through the new edition of Monocle magazine on a newsstand near you now. Stay tuned. All that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by global economics correspondent at the New York Times, Patty Cohen, and the journalist and Monocle Radio regular politics commentator, Vincent McAviney. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Good afternoon.
Patty, you, as I understand it, have recently been in Zambia speaking to climate-proof chickens.
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact, although...
Not a sentence I thought I'd ever...
I know, although I have to say they did not have a lot to say back, but...
Presumably, principally Begurk.
But actually, it was I took a 3-week reporting trip in Kenya and Zambia to report on a few different stories, and one of them has to do with a kind of breed of chicken that can be more resistant to climate change, and particularly in the poorest parts of the world. So it's actually kind of a fascinating program that the World Poultry Foundation is doing, and I bet you didn't know there was a World Poultry Foundation.
I did not know there was a World Poultry Foundation.
So much to learn. Anyway, it was a great trip, and I'm just getting over my jet lag today.
No, that does sound interesting, and readers of the New York Times can presumably read all about it in due course.
In due course, yes.
Is that what you're telling your editor as well?
No, actually, there's so much going on with the Trump administration that even from Africa, I was drafted to write about Russian sanctions and Ukraine and such. So it's hopefully I will get to it at some point.
Indeed. So, Vincent, you, meanwhile, have been running in circles around East London.
Yeah, that's right. I haven't gone as far, just the end of the Jubilee line from Baker Street. But I took part in the Olympic Park half marathon on Sunday, which is basically circumnavigating, crisscrossing through London's Olympic Park from the 2012 Games. And I hadn't been to the area for a little while. And it's remarkable because for a long time after the Olympics, they were sort of taking down some structures, building new ones. It felt like a building site. But kind of 13 years now on from the Games, you can really see, if done properly, if planned and with attention to detail, how you can kind of build what was a wasteland into a really active now and quite pleasant community. So something that we're always talking about here on Monocle, of course, urban design. It really is a good example for how you kind of get things right.
Well, which is heartening because it doesn't always happen like that with Olympic legacies.
No, not at all. You've got, think about Greece and Athens, the disaster there, but you do have some successes. Barcelona was known as the city with its back to the sea. It didn't really have a beachfront, but the Olympics there in '92 completely transformed that, although they made mistakes by putting some of the venues too high up on Montjuic. So London, with good transport connections and proper, housing that was able to be converted from an Olympic village to mixed-use housing, it does seem to be, not so much a ghost town, but somewhere people now are actually properly living.
Well, we will start in the United States, the Congress of which has, if only just, passed a colossal government spending bill which may have saved the job of House Speaker Mike Johnson, if of nobody else. The budget includes $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, funded partially by massive promised spending cuts, partially by running up US government debt even further. The vote was won 217 to 215 on party lines, with the exception of one Democrat who did not vote and one Republican who voted against. Raw milk swigging libertarian weirdo Thomas Massey of the Kentucky 4th, who believed the spending cuts were not deep enough. Patty, do we glean anything from this of what the new administration's priorities are going to be?
Well, This is the first step in what is a long and actually much more complicated process of passing a budget. So the fact that Congress was able to pass this, or excuse me, the House was able to pass this, is a sign that the House majority leader was able to kind of keep enough members in line to try and pass Trump's agenda in complete a form as possible. But in this case, the devil's in the details, and the Republicans are split between one faction, as you mentioned, which don't think the cuts are deep enough, even though Trump has made it clear he really doesn't care very much about the debt or the deficit. There is a group of Republican congressmen who clearly do. At the same time, there are other Republicans who were in close races that worry that the spending cuts are going to hit most heavily on Medicaid, which is the health program for the poor, which Trump had said he would not cut, as well as food supplemental aid for the poor. And so there is this fight actually within the Republican Party. But you definitely can see it as a win for Trump.
For the moment, at least, because, Vincent, to pick up on one of the points Patty makes there, $800 billion by some estimates will be stripped from Medicaid, which affects 72 million Americans directly, which is a lot of Americans, a great many of whom will be Republican voters from poorer Trump voting states.
Exactly. I mean, that's roughly the amount of Americans that actually voted, I think, for Donald Trump at the last election. And this is the thing. He is going in with his axe via Doge and cutting federal jobs. And those are both Democrats and Republicans. And these programs, Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, the food assistance program, those are things that don't just target Democrats. They target Republicans as well. So he's in danger of alienating his base. And it's interesting as well what they left out of this bill. They didn't put in the promise tax breaks, for instance, on tips, something that Donald Trump said he would do immediately. It helps him sort of gain votes in places like Nevada. And he doesn't seem interested in that now. What he has done is pass a whopping great tax cut for the top 4% of Americans. But when you boil it down, the numbers, the top 1% of Americans are doing phenomenally out of this, whereas everyone else's tax burden has indeed increased. So I think we can see where Donald Trump's priorities are, despite what he said in the campaign.
Where is the electoral logic of that, though, Patty? Because it's not surprising, I guess, that Donald Trump's budget should pass along those tax cuts principally to people who don't really need a tax cut. But there aren't that many of those people. There's a much greater number of people who could really use that money.
Well, that was also true in the first Trump administration, which did a very similar tax deal, which was cut taxes on the wealthy and increase them on poor and middle-class Americans, as well as cut programs that benefit them. There's a lot that's very illogical and in some ways irrational about politics in general, but particularly about American politics at this moment. And it's very clear that Trump has a very devoted following that at least so far are willing to kind of follow him no matter what he says. And I think that's just a manifestation of how polarized the American electorate is, which is my side is right, your side is wrong, and the details don't matter.
Vincent, as you said, it is Doge and Elon Musk who are being deployed as the hatchet people here. Is there anything to the theory, do you think, which I am just now cooking up in my head, that Musk is being set up to take the fall when and if this all goes horribly wrong? Because it would not be the first time that Donald Trump has cashiered somebody he hired and then said the man's a total idiot, never heard of him, we only met once or twice, etc.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this first administration was littered with people who he hugged tightly and then distanced himself from and then shafted, the likes of Anthony Scaramucci and all the others and landed the blame with them for anything that went wrong. So that is potentially what he's doing with Elon Musk. But his relationship with Musk seems to kind of transcend any that we have sort of seen. It seems that Musk really knows how to play him like a fiddle. Him standing over the cabinet yesterday with a T-shirt on saying tech support, very strange. I think at some point that relationship will break down. But for the moment, it seems like it is going pretty strong. It seems like, Trump thinks Elon Musk is a weirdo, but he does Donald Trump loves money, and there's no doubt about it. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, and Donald Trump respects that greatly.
Just finally on this, Paddy, a question of domestic American politics. Can Democrats take anything away from this vis-a-vis the narrowness of the win? The House right now, if I've done the numbers right, is 218 Republicans, 215 Democrats, and 2 vacant. I mean, it's not unimaginable that they could take a few wins off Trump, is it?
No, it's not. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen with the budget, though, because now what the next step is the Senate has to pass it. And if the Senate, passes it, which it probably will because there's a Republican majority there, then there's a process that approving the budget can go to that essentially circumvents the Democrats and can just be passed with a simple majority. And that will probably happen. As we go on, who knows if public sentiment changes, if congressmen are getting a lot of flack from their constituents. We saw a little bit of that in the last week. But I think, Trump has got a lot of goodwill, and he's doing so many things so quickly that it's kind of impossible for any person to keep track of it. And so, I think that remains to be seen as we go along.
Well, let's move along. And last year, i.e. 2024, entered the books as the greatest 12-month democratic experiment in human history. 1.65 billion votes were cast in 70-odd countries. It seems, therefore, an especially propitious moment to consider the findings of the Economist Intelligence Unit as it releases its annual Democracy Index. Counterintuitively, the overall picture is non-rosy. Indeed, just 6.6% of people now live in full democracies as opposed to 12.5% a decade back. Notable backsliders include South Korea, Romania and Bangladesh, while Norway enjoyed a 16th consecutive year at the top of the poll. Vincent, what leapt out at you from this survey?
I mean, it was shocking, that stat basically halving the amount of people living in full democracy in that time period. When you look at the map, I mean, there aren't sort of too many surprises, but the idea that France has slipped into the category of flawed democracy, I think we all know that the US was definitely going to be firmly in that category now and is slipping right to the bottom of it, some would say, given Donald Trump's pronouncements that he is a king. I'm sort of interested as well in recent figures that have been put out that there's a decline in those countries that are democracies amongst young people in belief that democracy is the best system. Perhaps, there are certain countries, China in particular, who are trying to float the idea that there is an alternative system, that actually you can have more stability if you just cede control and cede some freedoms. And that's something that we have seen being pumped out on the likes of TikTok, perhaps. So I'm really interested in attitudes to democracy as well. I think we all knew that it was under attack, but it's how people are in some ways giving up on it, which is quite alarming.
I mean, Paddy, do you see that narrative manifest in the current American political scene? Because one of the weirder things about the current Republican Party is that it seems to be both, it displays obvious authoritarian tendencies in sort of pledging allegiance to this figure at the top of the strange personality cult they have constructed, and yet it still trades in rhetoric of freedom and libertarianism and individualism.
Well, if you were to interview, let's say, the people who took part in the insurrection on January 6th, right, after Biden was elected and Trump maintained that was a fraud, they were claiming that they were, in fact, the real protectors of American democracy. And so I think that, to me, that's a kind of ridiculous assertion. But it's clearly, people have different definitions of what that means. And I think it's undoubtedly clear that, even in just the last 2 months, you can see a lot of processes, democratic processes, being undermined and the courts not really being that effective in stopping the president. And in fact, his team increasingly saying we don't even have to pay attention to the courts. If the president does it, it's legal. But I do think the wider backlash against democracy has been coming for a while. And I think that has to do with essentially the failure of liberal democracies and the capitalist system to really lift people's economic circumstances. And what I think that's part of the reason for this backlash is that inequality has grown dramatically, also particularly in the United States. And people just feel democratic capitalism did not deliver on the promises.
Do you get the sense that the same sentiment is at large in the United Kingdom? Because it is noticeable that in both elections held in the United States and the United Kingdom last year, turnout was not spectacular, unbelievably, to my mind, in the United States, in obviously a crucial election. Slightly more than a third of registered American voters simply couldn't be bothered. And here in the United Kingdom, where the election was arguably somewhat more of a foregone conclusion, 40% of people stayed home, at which point I do at least get to one of the rare occasions in which I can advance the sagacity of my fellow Australians.
To raise your great policy, actually.
In having instituted the compulsory vote, honestly, I don't know why more people don't do it. But nonetheless, do you detect the same thing here, Vincent, the idea that people in the UK are beginning to lose faith in democracy as a means of organising themselves?
I think people here are a little bit more invested in democracy compared to the United States. I think what we had last year with our election was it went so disastrously for the Tories. Mm-hmm. And for about 18 months, it was clear that they were on track not only to lose, but to dramatically lose and give Labour a landslide. And so I think there was a bit of ennui in the election, the time it was called as well, early July. There were some people away on holiday, all that kind of stuff. But I think here in the UK, I do like the idea, at the very least, that elections should be bank holidays or holidays, if not going to the full.
We have them on Saturdays in Australia. Well,
exactly. Or and
you get a sausage.
Saturday. Well, there we go. What's not to love? Yeah, but I think the one thing that I think the UK does quite well, and I've never quite understood this in the United States, because we now seem to see Trump operating in a vacuum, and there's real confusion on the Democratic side as to what to do and where the leadership is. I mean, the benefit of in most European democracies is you have at all times a leader of the opposition. I can't understand why the Democrats have to wait for 2 years to start a race which goes on for 18 months, which then gives someone only 3 or 4 months potentially to run against someone. Why can't the Democrats do all of that this year? Why can't they come up with a leader of the party now? And why wait? Donald Trump and the Republicans are tearing up all the rules. So what is the benefit for Democrats to wait all this time? Why not have someone run, have some kind of race this year, have a leader of the party who constantly speaks with one voice? Because it seems like so much is being done and the Democrats are being completely ignored and left on the hop. And there aren't any sort of stars of the party at the moment. Whereas if you started a race now, you could have a strong opposition voice, which might engage more people in the democratic process in the next sort of 2 years.
That strikes me as an entirely excellent suggestion. Patty, speaking on behalf of the United States, why would that not be possible? Why is that a thing the Democrats would not do?
Speaking on behalf of the United States, so in some ways there are leaders of the opposition. One would be the majority leader in the Senate, Charles Schumer, who's been around for a long time and who's not really seen as certainly not at this point. He's older, not seen as the future of the party, and has not been that effective in kind of corralling the opposition. The same thing with the majority leader in the House. To the extent that the race is starting, I guarantee you it probably is starting now. The problem is there's no clear candidate. There's no consensus person. Nobody even knows who it is. So while everyone's probably all the people who are thinking, gosh, do I have a chance? Do I have a shot? Or, forming their committees and looking into funding and speaking around. There really no one has emerged.
Why not lift the caucus and all of that forward? Why not do that? Why do you have to wait until down to the wire? This, if say, for instance, if it went to a floor fight of candidates in the Democratic conference, you're talking about then them, appointing that person in the summer and then having only sort of 2-3 months to go to another election. Why waste all this time now? And
yeah, I mean, unfortunately,
have a sort of proper elected leader.
Have the primary next month.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the Democratic Party is in disarray now, and I think they are kind of flummoxed as to how to respond to Trump and what to do. So I think it's kind of a lot of running around and kind of figuring out where to go.
Just before we move off this subject and to return to the global picture and to try and think of something upbeat and constructive, would anybody like to nominate? Well, I'm going to tell you both to nominate a country each which this time next year may have rocketed up some notches. It can be a wild outsider, but just somewhere that you would like a few quid on improving.
All right. Well, how about if I pick out a country now that has done better?
Go on.
Which is Bangladesh. Because they did get rid of a very authoritarian leader.
Which is what I think the authoritarian leader was the reason they had dropped in this poll. But you think next year they might be back up?
Yeah, I think so because she's gone. And,
that's true.
There's a very renowned economist who's currently temporarily leading the country, but at least this very entrenched regime is gone. So perhaps that's hopeful.
Vincent, would you like to pick one?
Yeah, one I'd keep an eye on is Romania, because it's been downgraded this year into sort of hybrid regime. It's had huge levels of Russian interference. This sort of sock puppet candidate that ran for president, they had to sort of then cancel one of the rounds that they had held. Illegal social media tactics, campaign finance violations. It is, of course, an EU nation, and I think it's going to come under pressure to sort of sort the house out. But the fact that it did kind of step up and disqualify this or sort of reset the process when this candidate who emerged from nowhere, who had strong anti-EU, pro-Putin views, was clearly sort of a massive influence operation was behind him. And they managed to pause this whole thing and say, no, we're not going to allow this to happen.
Well, let us now consider international rail travel, which all civilised people can agree is vastly preferable to air travel, or at least would be if the law permitted the exemplary mob-handed battering of passengers playing audio out loud on their phones, followed by the unceremonious heaving of their semi-conscious form out of a window and into the trackside hedgerows at 300 kilometres per hour. Though it has long been possible to travel directly from London to Paris and one or two other destinations, new direct services are being mooted that will link Zurich, Geneva, Frankfurt, Bordeaux and Cologne, among others, to King's Cross St Pancras. Patty, are you enthused by that prospect?
I am very enthusiastic about this prospect, and I'm all for better train travel. And I also think, even aside from my own personal interest or that of my fellow travelers and tourists, one of the things that the EU has talked a lot about and that it's worried about is its competitiveness. And there's many reasons why perhaps it is lagging in competitiveness with the U.S. and China. But one of them has to do with a kind of really good transportation system among various countries in Europe and, introduction of more high-speed rail and such to kind of facilitate this. So I think it could also be beneficial for the European economy.
Do you, Vincent, have a cut-off point for rail versus air, like the number of hours by rail at which point you start thinking, actually, I'd rather fly?
Well, I have to say, I once took a train from Los Angeles to Chicago. It took 2.5 days.
That sounds excellent.
So, I'm maybe not the person to test on that because I sat through that experience, which was, if you've ever been on a US train, my God, they are slow. There were some beautiful views, but it was a slow chug along those tracks. And then I did I sort of had a bit of time in Chicago and then did a day and a half between Chicago and Boston. And they were beautiful journeys, but yeah, they could have been much speedier. So, I mean, this, I think, reflects the fact that there was never meant to be this kind of monopoly of the Eurostar just operating on the Channel Tunnel. There were meant to be multiple franchises running different kinds of routes. But at the time in the 90s, you had the boom in low-cost airlines, and that kind of meant that people were just hopping on planes for £5 and heading to Prague. Whereas now people are thinking a lot more about their air travel. We're potentially also going to see higher levels of taxation on people who fly more frequently here in the UK. So I think they're seeing that there's a gap in the market of not only people wanting to do this, but it could be financially actually more sensible for them to do European journeys like this.
And I will just add also that, the Eurostar is incredibly expensive.
It is.
It is, yeah.
Particularly if you don't get your tickets in advance. And there was an event that I had several friends in Paris coming to London, and they all ended up flying because it was so much cheaper.
Yep.
And the time difference, actually, if anything, was probably longer by the time you included transportation to the airport and going through security. But I mean, the prices on Eurostar are just incredibly high.
When I went to the Olympics last summer, that was the exact same situation. The flight was, I think, a fourth the price of the train. And so that's something that I did. I will say, though, my favorite little Channel Tunnel fact, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, in 2017, it was revealed in government papers that were declassified that when the idea was first being mooted, when they were planning it, there was a secret British plan to bury a nuclear weapon underneath the line in case Soviet tanks ever rampaged across Europe and to destroy the connection. Wow. Now, they then obviously thought, well, the Soviet Union's gone, we don't need to think about that anymore. But, that prospect is slightly looming back against us now, isn't it? But
wait, did it have to be nuclear? That seems a bit excessive.
I think they thought it needed to be to sort of bring the whole thing down.
I mean, couldn't you just brick up one end of it?
Well, this was their idea.
I did not know that.
It wasn't going to be great if you lived in Kent, but yeah, this was an actual plan.
Is it ever? But sticking with the theme of reasons to avoid air travel to Japan, specifically to Kyushu Saga International Airport, which has opened a karaoke booth in which passengers may while away a wait by bellowing tone-deaf interpretations of their popular song favourites for 100 yen a time, which is only about 53 pence, so leaves well and truly open the possibility that anyone within earshot can offer them 200 yen to stop. The target market, according to its operators, is departing passengers trying to get rid of Japanese pocket change and who clearly simply cannot countenance giving it to charity. Patty, if this option was there, a karaoke booth in an airport, would you avail yourself of it, or if that's the right way around those words should go?
I definitely would not. And what I want to know is it occurring in soundproof rooms?
Well, I hope and / assume so. In fairness to Japan and to the Japanese people, they do actually have a rarefied sense of civic courtesy, which I wish more of us would learn from. So I would be surprised if this blared across the departures lounge. Vincent, would you be keen on this?
I mean, I think in a lot of other countries, I would happily pay just to have a soundproof booth that I can hang out in an airport. But in Japan, people, as you say, they're very courteous, very quiet and respectful, so not quite needed. But I can think of one or two airports I've been to where, I would pay just to have that quiet space and just turn the little karaoke machine off.
I mean, to return to my earlier fantasy of throwing people out of trains for playing audio on their phones, I suspect, sat in this chair before and suggested that airports should have patrols equipped with tasers to deal with people who are doing exactly that, which I think would not only have a civilizing effect on passenger behaviour, but would greatly enlarge the general gaiety. But on that thought, Patty, there are airports, Heathrow and Nashville being among them, which actually subject passengers to live performers. Like, why is anybody... This is not something anybody wants, is it?
Well, what about at King's Cross Station? Isn't there a piano, or St. Pancras, that any passerby can start playing?
Yeah, I know. And listeners may guess my views on that as well.
So, fortunately, I don't think I have ever been exposed to that live music at the airport. And I think the bigger problem is airports that are so overcrowded that you don't even have enough seats for the passengers that
this is true.
There, regardless, waiting. And I think Gatwick comes to mind as one of them, regardless of to whether there's music or not. So I think more chairs would be a good idea.
More chairs. I mean, are there any inane sideshow attractions you would like to see in it? I mean, I'm a great sucker for Dodgem cars. I think that would cheer up a wait for a plane enormously.
I mean, I just can't think of anything that comes to mind. I am definitely someone that just thinks, like, get through the airport. I used to love flying. Now I'm just like, get through the airport as quick as possible, get on the flight and just leave the airport space behind. They've become such kind of, very over-sensory experiences, and it would just be nice if they calmed down a bit, I think.
Yes, I agree with you.
Well, on that note of consensus, Patty Cohen and Vincent McAviney, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, Monocle's March issue is now on newsstands everywhere. Editor Josh Fennett sat down with Associate Culture Editor Sophie Monaghan-Coombs to take us behind the cover and dive into their favourite stories in this Monocle's Property Special.
Sophie, what an absolute pleasure. We're here to talk about this rather beautiful new magazine in front of us, the March issue on newsstands now. You've got it open on a rather sunny, springy-looking page. What on earth are your highlights?
Well, obviously, as you know and our listeners might know, that March is the property special edition.
Nobody knows that. It's good we
of
told
Monocle. Well, now they do. And the first story I wanted to highlight fits into that theme, but it sits in my section, the culture section. And it's all about the transformation of a particular building in Tirana, the capital of Albania, that used to be the home of Enver Hoxha, who's a Stalinist dictator who lived there for about 40 years. It's this mad, crazy house that he had built exactly to his specifications. And he did that at a time in which he was kind of criticising and banning lots of Western influences for everyone else in the country. But at the same time, he was kitting out this house with the kind of latest Italian fashions and features and fixtures and things like that. So it's a kind of incredible house in itself. And it's just been taken over by an art foundation. So they are inviting artists to come and spend a few months there to create works that kind of, are in relationship with the building itself, and also to kind of breathe new life into what is a very painful historical kind of memory in the centre of Tirana.
So interesting, isn't it, how this idea of property can feel like it's just about breaking new ground or tall buildings or headline projects that put cities on the map or don't put cities on the map because they're not that good. Actually, when we think about property here at Monocle, we're sort of talking about a living, breathing thing, a place that interacts with people and makes people feel something. Was it controversial, the reopening of this space to people, or was it cathartic?
No, I don't think it's been controversial, although the people working on it said that it's in this kind of particular area called Bloku, which is known as Bloku, which is like leader's block. So all of the kind of Hoxha's regime kind of administrators lived there. And in general, people apparently kind of looked away when they passed this house because everyone knew what it was and what had happened there. But it was a really kind of sore spot in the city's memory. And now the area around it is thriving. It's full of restaurants and bars, and there's a lot of kind of life there. And so I think the house is kind of fitting into that. But what are some of your highlights from this issue, Josh?
Good question. I mean, Christopher Lord, our erstwhile business editor, executive editor, marshalled through this amazing property survey. Lots of examples from around the world. He's solicited opinion from the head of MIPIM, the great property show in Cannes, which we'll be attending en masse as Monocle, and interviewed some interesting developers who are doing things from enlivening streetscapes, building better homes, and really thinking about the impact that property has, not just for creating value for the investor, which obviously is one thing that gets properties off the ground, in the ground, and tongues wagging, but also, I suppose, for the people that call them home. And the reason this is interesting for Monocle is our cities are at a bit of a crossroads. What can companies do to get people back to the office if you're not creating spaces that people want to frequent? What can people do in a housing crisis? I wrote for the Monocle Minute this week for the launch of the issue about the UK's woeful house building targets. And I also wonder, as well as looking at targets and looking at the bottom line and making sure these things are profitable, if we're thinking about creating the kind of spaces in our cities that will be beloved for generations. I happen to be in the middle of a home renovation myself in an old building, and you realise that the proportions sometimes of Edwardian and Victorian architecture is so much more thoughtful and better for creating streets and spaces that people want to be in than the creation of penthouses, which are great for, selling by the square foot, but maybe not so good for the city. I should also say there's a property special, but there's so much else happening in the issue too. I love Simon Bouvier, our Paris bureau chief, as a man, of course, but also his piece on ITER, this amazing facility in the south of France where they're pioneering a type of scientific research which goes across borders. They have scientists from all over the world working together on an energy solution. I won't ask you about the particulars of nuclear fusion, but I know that you've read and enjoyed the piece. And I think that's the great thing about an issue of Monocle. There are solutions, there are ideas. We take you to places in the world you might not otherwise see and present you with some solutions in a newscape and a landscape and an Anglophone media that sometimes can appear preoccupied with the problems. I reckon we've got time for one more story. What else caught your eye?
Yes, well, you mentioned Simon there. He's been very busy. He's got a story I also love him and his work, and he's written something for me for this issue, which is very different to the nuclear story you just mentioned. But he profiled the CEO and editor of L'Express, a French magazine that has...
You're not pronouncing the X in that, is that correct?
That is correct, actually.
L'Express,
I did try.
not L'Express.
Yes, L'Express.
What a fool I've been.
I know. Didn't want to correct you, George, but L'Express magazine, which has had a little bit of a tricky time, and the current CEO took it over in about 5 or 6 years ago, and he's just turned a profit on it. And so we're talking about how he's managed to do that and some of his big ambitions for the publication going forward. So he's really trying to use new technology to translate a lot of their amazing reporting work and making it more accessible to people across the EU, not just in France. And I think it's a really interesting, very kind of hopeful story about print media today.
And I love a story about a turnaround CEO, someone who comes in and sees the problems, but also sees some solutions there. Because our producer, Anita, cannot control us, I'm going to go on for a little bit longer. She's waving behind the glass, but you don't need to worry about that. In the concierge section, we have a great guide put together by James Chambers of all the best places to shop and eat around Bangkok. It looks amazing, and it's a super interesting format with an illustrated guide that we've been doing for the past few issues. You have to look at that. And then the expo. The glossy bit at the back of the magazine is my favourite story, actually, from the issue.
Beautiful.
It's all about late night eating. And I suppose as the days get longer for spring, the nights can get longer too. And we can celebrate those places where you can have an impromptu meal, where you can have maybe one too many drinks and then something to eat to soak it up. And just where magic happens, because cities need bright points, they need high new buildings, apparently, they need spaces to live, but also I think they need dark corners to work, and they need spaces where people can conspire and have convivial moments. And this expo, this celebration of late night eating has, I hope, just that.
That was Josh Fennett and Sophie Monaghan-Coombs introducing the new issue of Monocle magazine, which is on a newsstand somewhere very near you now or extremely shortly. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Patty Cohen and Vincent McAviney. The show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.